Hello there, everyone. Jesse here well, I think you know what the date is. And I probably don't have to tell anybody the significance of this date. We are at the 12th anniversary of 9/11, of course. And being a truther, undoubtedly that's my label, if people were to label me, or a conspiracy theorist. We all know how they use that term by now. It's regrettable sometimes when you come up to this anniversary to see how little has changed in terms of the progress in revealing the false flag of 9/11, one of the greatest false flags in recent history. And false flags are nothing new, and an extremely powerful way for a government to control its people and move them in the direction that it wishes to move them, like sheep. We all know that. And so today we are back at the anniversary of 9/11, and the first thing I guess that any of us should do on a day like this is remember the victims, because despite everything that happened and happened since, and everything that has been brought in since the 9/11 event occurred, there were still about 3,000 people that lost their lives in one of the most horrific scenes in television history. I mean, really, in many ways, 9/11 was packaged for television. And I think in a way it's good in a sense that it was all over the televisions. Not so much at the time, because it was used so easily to push everybody in the direction which they wanted to go, which was to invade the Middle East and create the police state that they've created, go after the oil, help Israel in their quest to take control of that region. Allow the shadow government to implement all the things that it's wanted to implement. But nonetheless, we have to remember the victims, because they're the ones that were the innocent on that day. And then we have all kind of been innocent since, not having very much control over how the event was used and how all our lives changed dramatically since that day. Some people just never figure it out. I've watched a couple clips this morning off of YouTube, and wanted to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's being posted. Here's Noam Chomsky on Democracy Now!, and I'm going to listen in to him reflecting on 9/11 with Amy Goodman.
I will respond to that, though. My own view is that we should be concentrating on the first 9/11, the one in Chile, which was a much worse attack by any dimension. But the one here was very significant. It was a major terrorist act, thousands of people killed. It's the first time since the War of 1812 that U.S. territory had been attacked. The United States has had remarkable security, and this, therefore, was, aside from the horrible atrocity, a very significant historical event. And it changed attitudes and policies in the United States quite considerably. In reaction to this, the government was able to ram through laws, Patriot Act, others that sharply constrained civil liberties. It was able to provide pretexts for invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, destruction of Iraq, consequences of spread through the region, and it provides it's the basis for Obama's massive terrorist war. The drone war is the most extreme terrorist campaign that's underway now, maybe the most extreme in history, and the justification for it was the same the second 9/11, 9/11/2001. So yes, it's had enormous effects on the society, on attitudes, on policies. Many victims throughout the world can testify to that.
How?
Yeah, it's amazing sometimes how somebody as bright as Noam Chomsky cannot see the forest for the trees. You know, I mean, he says everything that was brought in. You know, he mentions the significance of the event being the first time that the United States was attacked on its own soil since 1812. That's not true, of course, because Pearl Harbor was American soil. I guess he meant that most of the attacks at Pearl Harbor happened in the water. And then he goes on to say how remarkable their security is. Well, if you've got the world's largest military, and you are isolated from most of the world, let's be honest. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, going back to World War I, that Woodrow Wilson and the isolationist sort of stance that the United States took up until they decided to involve themselves in that conflict, which really helped turn the tide. And also even in the Second World War, not getting involved until being attacked on Pearl Harbor. Of course, most of us now, people who've studied history and understand the events leading up to Pearl Harbor, it's one of the things I studied back in university at the time, was that the Americans knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. They wanted it to happen. They prepared for it. They even took most of their fleet out of or at least their ships that they didn't want to be sunk. They had a bunch of older ships that were left there. It was the perfect pretext for, convincing the sheeple, the people, that war was necessary. And perhaps that war was more necessary than many of the other wars. I mean, it was inevitable, the war between Japan and the United States, when you have two imperialist powers that are trying to take control of the Pacific, which was the overall sort of tug-of-war that was happening at the time. You had the imperial Japanese expanding rapidly throughout the Pacific, and its only major rival was the United States. So it was just a matter of time before they duked it out, as has happened many, many times before throughout history, and will happen again, unfortunately. But yet, Noam Chomsky, he goes on about how they were able to ram through all these laws, the Patriot Act, they use it as a pretext to invade Afghanistan, to invade Iraq, it formed the basis for the drone wars, the most extreme, as he calls it, in U.S. history, and all this stuff, and yet he can't figure it out. He can't figure it out that it was set up all along. And so, I don't know why he can't figure that out. Maybe that's something to do with his own ego. Who knows? But most of us who are going to look back on 9/11 can remember all the lies that we were fed. I don't know if you remember this woman here, Tanya Head, who claimed to be at the 78th floor of the World Trade. She had all these stories about taking somebody's ring. So another victim who died, and then she became the president of the World Trade Survivors Network. There's a lot of videos on her on YouTube here. Here's one I'll show you on CNN. Of course, CNN, being a total arm of the New World Order, is the perfect propaganda platform to put these stories in, with a dolled-up host here to keep short attention spans fixated on the narrative that was sold to the people during that fateful day. So let's give a listen here.
Head, which is one of 19 people who had been above the point of impact in the South Tower, lived to tell about it. After being badly burned, Tanya witnessed the decapitation of her assistant before coming across a dying man who begged her to deliver his wedding ring to his wife. Her own survival, she said, was made possible by the thoughts of beautiful white dress she would be wearing for her fiancé Dave on their wedding day. Soon after, this woman would learn that Dave, who had been working in the North Tower, didn't make it. Despite that devastating loss, Tanya became a beacon of hope. She lobbied to have survivors invited to annual 9/11 commemorations, have them represented in the 9/11 Museum, even gave Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg a tour of Ground Zero. But Tanya, you see, had a very dark secret. She wasn't even in the United States on September 11th. It was all a lie. Robin Fisher and Angelo Guglielmo Jr. wrote about Tanya's extraordinary deception. Their new book is entitled The Woman Who Wasn't There. Angelo, who'd been friends with Tanya, told me about how they first met.
So just another example of unbelievable lies that were sold to us over and over again. There's so many of them during that day. These figures that they put up to sell the narrative, to, help push the Kleenex boxes around the United States and the rest of the world. Looking back on 9/11, I remember it very clearly. I was getting ready to go to school. I had a big day, I think 4 classes in that day, and so I was up pretty early, fixing to get a train around 9 o'clock to go to downtown Montreal. And the news came in over the radio, which I was listening to at the time, and that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And I think that was probably the fastest that I ever reached for a television remote. I grabbed my remote as quickly as possible, had it on CNN, saw that it was quite significant what had happened, and watched the second plane come in live and the World Trade Center while speaking on the phone with many family members who were, like everyone else, myself included, absolutely horrified by what was happening. And we're almost like a sister city to New York, Montreal, very close cities. We're only about a 5-hour drive if you didn't have the border to go through. So, I've been to New York several times. Most of my family has been to New York. I have many friends in New York. I had a friend who actually worked on Wall Street who managed to get to Battery Park to avoid asphyxiating to death on the fumes from the collapse of the World Trade Centers. So, it was an event that hit home pretty hard. And the narrative that was used on the day, the fact that they right away seemed to know who it was. Probably one of the best examples is Paul Bremer, who was supposed to be in the World Trade Center. I believe his offices was in the World Trade Center. Of course, he had a convenient reason for not being there. He is one of the masterminds of, or at least one of the key players in the false flag. And it's worthy to look back on his appearance at 12:46 p.m. on 9/11, a few hours after the first plane had hit. How conveniently he wasn't in the World Trade Center, and how he seemed to know right away who was behind the attack. So
we want to turn now to a guest who is joining us in the studio. It's Paul Bremer. I want to make sure I'm getting your name right because I'm just meeting you just at this moment. You're a terrorism expert.
Counterterrorism, I hope.
And to talk to us a little bit about who could. I mean, there are a limited number of groups who could be responsible for something of this magnitude.
Yes, this is a very well planned, very well coordinated attack, which suggests it's very well organized centrally, and there are only 3 or 4 candidates in the world, really, who could have conducted this attack.
Yeah, so right away, this is very important. I think it was the first top official to come out and right away say this is a highly organized attack. Of course, it was a highly organized attack. He's part of the whole organization behind the attack, and right away said 3 or 4, which gets right down to 1 as they start mentioning Osama bin Laden.
Bin Laden comes to mind right away.
There you go, Bin Laden.
Indeed, he certainly does. Bin Laden was involved in the first attack on the World Trade Center, which had as its intention doing exactly what happened here, which was to collapse both towers. He certainly has to be a prime suspect, but there are others in the Middle East, and there are at least 2 states, Iran and Iraq, which should at least remain on the list of potential suspects.
What kind of coordination would...
So right away, This is hours after the attack. First we have Osama bin Laden is the very first name mentioned. I think this was the first time that his name was mentioned in connection with the terror attack. Iran and Iraq right after. And it's amazing that people like Chomsky can't see it. You know, they can't see it. How stupid do you have to be to not understand how fooled you are by this whole thing? So let's listen a little bit more here.
I mean, how could something like this be put together?
Well, you'd have to have, first of all, you've got to find some people who are willing to die, which is not that easy. And then, of course, they have to find ways around what we thought was pretty good security at our airports. We haven't had a hijacking in a long time, let alone 4. So there had to have been some very good coordination there. There has to have been coordination in the whole planning of the attack. The people, if they were not Americans, had to get visas to get into the United States. They needed false identities probably to buy airplane tickets. They needed cars to get to the airport. I mean, there's a whole...
All provided by the CIA.
Lot of stuff that had to happen here.
Go ahead.
Well, with as many resources as our government and our allies' governments around the world devote to studying terrorism and knowing what's going on and what they're planning, you have to wonder how something of this magnitude, how this could take place without any warning or any hint that it was coming.
First of all, the intelligence against terrorists is the hardest intelligence there is to gather. Basically, you have to have a spy in the terrorist group who's willing to talk to you for whatever reason. It's the hardest intelligence there is. The National Commission on Terrorism, which I chaired last year, made as our key recommendation a much more vigorous effort to try to get terrorist spies as informing on their colleagues to us. Every time there's a major terrorist attack, it is automatically, of course, an intelligence failure. That's by definition. But I'm sympathetic to the problem about how you get good intelligence on these people. It's not easy. There is an intelligence failure here. There's a massive security failure where we have 4 airplanes being hijacked in the same morning, 2 from Dulles Airport, it appears. So there's a lot of lessons that are going to have to be learned. But first, we've got to find out who did it.
Mr. Bremer, I want to speak to that for a second. When the Oklahoma City incident occurred, the immediate response from a lot of people was that it came from some Arab terrorist group. Is there any reason why we ought to be cautious about that kind of an assumption on this particular incident, on these incidents?
Well, of course. What you have to work with at this stage, since we don't have any hard intelligence apparently and we don't have any forensic evidence, is motivations and capabilities. And so when I list 4 potential groups, I'm working mostly from motivations and proven capabilities in the past. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that you can exclude that some other kind of group could have come out of nowhere and done this, but at least as a working hypothesis in the first chaotic hours here after this attack, you have to start somewhere, and you have to start with what you know about the past and which groups have motives.
One of the things that the President said today from Florida early on was that the United States will respond to this, and he left it at that. Is it to be assumed that the first thing that we have to figure out is to identify precisely who it is we're going to respond against?
Of course. Basically, we have sort of a 4-stage operation here. First, we've got to hope and help that we can save as many people as possible, stabilize the situation in the Pentagon and in New York. Secondly, we need to get to work on trying to identify the perpetrators. And then thirdly, we come to the question about retaliation. And fourthly, which goes along all along at the same time, is what are the lessons we learned? What did we learn about the intelligence failure? What did we learn about the security failure? And how do we move forward in the future on those areas?
I don't recall anything like this. Pearl Harbor happened a month before I was born, and I hear my parents talk about that as a seminal event in their lives all the time. I am not aware of anything like this in the United States before. Americans are now, I think it's fair to say, really scared. Should we be?
This is a day that will change our lives, isn't it?
It is a day that will change our lives. It's a day when the war that the terrorists declared on the United States, and after all, they did declare war on us, has been brought home to the United States in a much more dramatic way than we've seen before. So it will change our lives. I do think it's important, and I'm sure the President and his colleagues, when they start talking about this, it's important to hit some balance. The American way of life is not threatened by these people. unless we threaten it ourselves. If we start throwing away the democratic freedoms and the civil liberties that are at the heart of our society, that's what they're after, and that's what we can't allow to have happen. And we've got to go about our business. People have got to move around. I was diverted on a plane this morning. I was trying to get to New York and wound up in Baltimore, and I in a way was sort of at least relieved to see business as usual going on among people. We have to go on with our lives. It's not to say we don't take it seriously. We take it very seriously, but it's not something where we can all jump in a foxhole somewhere and hope the world doesn't come and bother us. We have to find a balanced response, one that makes it absolutely clear, as the President said this morning, that we're not going to tolerate this act of war. This will have consequences for the people who did it. I hope, very severe consequences. I hope the most severe military response we can come up with. But we also have to remember that we've got a way of life to protect, and that this doesn't threaten. This is not an existential threat to the United States.
All right. Paul Bremer, thank you.
We appreciate it, Mr. Bremer. Thank you.
Yeah, you're probably like me, and you see the irony of his comments and how his shadow government helped push in all these Patriot Acts and National Defense Authorization Acts, all these laws, the TSA, of course, the explosion of the security within the United States, the incredible amount of DHS, all these things that were created in response to 9/11, but were planned far in advance, and talking about how severe the repercussions will be for the countries involved, or the perpetrators, so-called perpetrators of the event. I think this is one of the more important interviews that was given on 9/11. As I said, I believe it's the very first time that Osama bin Laden's name was mentioned, and when you're already a few hours after the event pinning the blame on somebody, well, then you know the fix is on, right? And that's how it worked. There were so many lies that were pushed around. I'll touch on a few of them just because I can't do it all, and there's so many other people out there doing wonderful work on 9/11. There's so many great researchers that have dug into it, scientists, architects, engineers, who have completely dismantled the official story, which is 100% bullshit. Let's listen in here to Hyman Brown, who claimed to be the architect of 9/11, with Dan Rather.
More snow tonight. Now to a different kind of problem. The World Trade Center towers were some of the most famous buildings in the world, of course. They've survived hurricanes, fires, and even one previous terrorist bombing. NBC's Roger O'Neill talked to the architect of those buildings and how they were put up and what brought them down.
Hyman Brown was the project engineer on the Twin Towers, the man on the ground in charge of making sure the buildings were built right, the way it was designed.
There was a lot of pride in it, and we were doing something that hadn't been done before. But no one ever considered any types of forces like this.
Brown, who spent 6 years building the towers from day one in 1966, says the planes didn't cause the towers to collapse, but rather the fire and tremendous heat that exposed the steel superstructure to forces it could not withstand.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
Each tower was built around a central core. That core kept the building up, supporting the tower's so-called dead weight. But when steel melts, according to Brown, like dominoes, it falls. Brown says the towers were built to withstand 200-mile-an-hour hurricanes, the 100-year storm, the worst nature could dish out. But he says an airplane crash never entered anyone's mind. Still, it appears the outside towers, made of prefabricated steel, absorbed most of the energy from the planes and may have kept the two towers from collapsing immediately. University of Colorado engineering professor Stein Steuer thinks the energy from those large planes would be equivalent to a medium 5 or 6 Richter scale earthquake.
As the airplanes came in and hit, energy was absorbed tremendously. Some of that core may have been damaged tremendously, and maybe this was part caused to this implosion.
The way the towers collapsed seems similar to pictures we've become accustomed to watching, as old buildings like the Kingdome in Seattle are taken down with explosives. Mark Loaz, whose controlled demolition company does that sort of work, says once a building starts falling, it releases a lot of stored energy.
We use explosives as a catalyst to release that potential energy, converts it into kinetic energy, gets the building moving.
NBC's Roger O'Neill tonight on the stunning destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center here in Manhattan as a result of a terrorist attack. All hour long, we've been trying to bring you Rahema Ellis and her diary of what she went through during the day, and we're going to do that for you right now.
Good old Dan Lather. Well, that's a nice little story, except that guy Hyman Brown was not an architect. He had nothing to do with 9/11, and is just another fucking bullshit motherfucker who came forth to spew the official narrative of the story. And there's so, as I said, there's so many examples. Of course, the guy who claimed to be the witness who said, well, they must have collapsed because of the intense heat of the explosions and the fuel from the planes, you know, and he seemed to know right away what caused the towers to collapse, and yet his credentials as an engineer are limited to being a B-movie actor or a C-movie actor. There was so many of them, even at the Pentagon. And I won't get into all these things because it's way too much. I'm going to look here at Corbett, James Corbett here, who put up a short video here on the 9/11 truth and the way forward, starting a real criminal investigation. Of course, this is what we all kind of hope for, is that somehow we can ride the momentum. Now, I said opening here how it's frustrating how little has changed and how 9/11 is still being used to usher in all these things. And of course, we're constantly under the threat of terrorism, and they never give us a break from it. And as soon as we think, well, things are going well, then they raise the terror alert, or they have another false flag like Boston bombing, and then we're right back to where we were before, only a little bit more scared perhaps. But if somehow the momentum that seems to be gaining traction over the last few years, I'd say this year perhaps has been the best in terms of people waking up. I think YouTube, the internet, has a lot to do with that, because so much has come forth regarding the Building 7 as being one of the greatest examples of how implausible the official story is. I don't need to show Building 7 here. It's pretty obvious. I'm sure almost everybody's seen it by now. And yet they're putting up billboards in places like Toronto and New York saying, did you know that a third tower collapsed on the day? And that's a great way of getting people to, probably the best way to get people to, if you have family, friends who are completely ignorant and refuse to even acknowledge the possibility of it being a false flag. Well, if you can sit them in front of a computer and show them, or a tablet or something, and show them Building 7 collapsing, then you can try to get them to explain how a building like that could collapse at free fall steel structure or modern steel structure. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. And there's nobody in the world that can argue otherwise. It's just not possible. And the NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, the joke of a report that they gave saying that office fires caused the collapse, and that a single column collapsed and caused all the other, it's the biggest lie ever. It's such a joke. So Building 7 continues to be the strongest evidence, but there's so much more. I mean, all the the three towers. There's so much evidence. So let's listen to James and talking about how to start a real criminal investigation. I think this is important because this is where ultimately, if we really want to reverse 9/11, if we really want to expose the shadow government and what they've done, then we need to have a legitimate investigation. not the joke of an investigation that came a couple of years after the events, when all the information was discarded, all the intelligence was censored, everything was covered up. So let's listen to James here.
This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your Eye-Opener Report for BoilingFrogsPost.com. Preserve the crime scene, follow the money trail, establish the motive, look for those with the means to pull off the crime. Any criminal investigator will tell you that these are the most basic principles of any investigation, but none of them were followed on 9/11. In the days and weeks after the attacks, Ground Zero was sealed off by then Mayor Rudy Giuliani, not to preserve the crime scene evidence, but to hasten its destruction. Over 350,000 tons of steel was carted away in the first few months, with most of it being sold to companies like Baosteel of China, which paid 25% under market price for the scrapped steel. FEMA's own building performance investigation team was prevented from entering Ground Zero or even taking steel samples from the salvage yards for their own report. The National Institute of Standards and Technology tasked with writing the definitive report on the collapse of the towers admitted, apparently without irony, that it did not test the WTC steel for evidence of explosives as mandated by federal law because there was no evidence of explosives. NORAD provided 4 separate and contradictory stories of its response to the events that morning. Some of the 9/11 commissioners believed that members of the Pentagon had lied to Congress in their testimony, and the commission convened a secret meeting in the summer of 2004 to debate sending the matter to the Justice Department for criminal investigation, but they did not proceed with this proposal. The SEC ended its investigation into the insider trading that took place on stocks of companies affected by the attacks because the suspects of its investigation had no known ties to Al-Qaeda, and thus were, by the terms of the SEC probe, free from suspicion of guilt. The SEC later destroyed all records related to their investigation, the largest such investigation in SEC history, as part of what it called routine record keeping. Famously, not one single person so much as lost their job with regard to the events of 9/11, let alone faced criminal prosecution for their culpability in the attack. Of course, there was no serious criminal investigation, no attempt to preserve the evidence or establish the means, motive, or opportunity, no inclination to follow the money. The 9/11 Commission itself concluded that the funding of the attacks was of little practical significance. From the very first moments after the attack, the fix was in. Now, 12 years later, one of the researchers who has painstakingly pieced together the details of the attack in order to identify 19 alternate suspects who should be considered in any serious investigation is Kevin Ryan, a whistleblower at Underwriters Laboratory who lost his position when he refused to go along with the company line on the causes for the collapse of the Twin Towers. After 10 years of research into the names and connections behind the 9/11 attack and its subsequent cover-up, Kevin Ryan has released a new book synthesizing that research. Another 19, Identifying Legitimate 9/11 Suspects, seeks to propose an alternate 19 suspects to the alleged hijackers that we have been asked to believe perpetrated the attacks that day. The list includes Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, the highest-ranking administration officials in Washington that day, and 2 people who had been intimately involved with continuity of government planning that was actually enacted on the morning of 9/11 and may still be in operation today. Frank Carlucci of the Bush bin Laden-connected Carlyle Group, Richard Armitage, who oversaw the State Department which instituted the Visa Express program through which many of the alleged hijackers obtained their visas to enter the country, Louis Freeh of the FBI and George Tenet of the CIA, Ralph Eberhardt, Michael Canavan, and Benedict Sliney, who helped oversee the air defense failure that morning, Rudy Giuliani, who put the Emergency Management Office in WTC Building 7 in the years before the attack, and then oversaw the destruction of the Ground Zero crime scene, and numerous others, including corporations like SAIC, Kroll, KUAM, and Stratesec, that all had intimate ties to the events of 9/11. Earlier this week, I had the chance to talk to Kevin Ryan about his investigation, including those people who were most responsible for perpetuating the cover-up of 9/11 and blocking the investigation into these legitimate 9/11 suspects.
Great work again, James. You would do yourself a favor by subscribing to the Corbett Report and checking out Boiling Frogs. This is the type of news that the world needs, and these are the type of people that are interested in bringing us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but, and not the clowns that we see on cable news. That is the big question, though, is how can we get this investigation underway, and can we ensure that it wouldn't be somehow taken over and used to discredit the truther movement. There are so many great, excellent videos on 9/11. I think the Alien Scientist has one of the best ones. It's very quick, though, and there's a lot of names involved, and so you might want to bring a notepad if you're going to watch that one. I think it's called 9/11 Who Did It. I can't remember the exact name of it. I didn't get it lined up. I should have. But there's many, many more. Of course, that book, Another 19, is an excellent read for anybody who wants to know who is really responsible. And James is 100% right. I mean, none of, I think the other day I likened it to a criminal or homicide investigation where no motive is established, none of the major suspects are interviewed. I mean, it's ridiculous, but of course the control that they have and had, especially back then, made it so impossible for any sort of real traction. And we were all hit so hard. I mean, as I said, thinking back to 9/11, I remember I think I actually ended up taking the bus downtown because I missed that train and missed 2 or 3 of my classes. Riding in the bus, everyone was silent, and this is before smartphones and all that crap was going on. Walking in the city of Montreal, downtown, there was an eerie silence. People were congregating in cafes. You'd walk into a cafe and there would be almost whispering, and everybody would be staring up at the screens. We were all traumatized by the events that happened there, and then in the aftermath, the sort of fellowship, brotherhood that was brought in. I mean, my mother put an American flag around a tree in the front yard, just things like that. I mean, everybody was putting American flags, trying to support United States, thinking naively, of course, that the United States was really attacked by some terrorist organization. And now, many, many years after, people are awakening to the fact that terrorists had little to do with the whole thing, or that the terrorists that exist in this world are the ones that are in the shadow government who are terrorizing people of their own countries again and again and again. So it's a somber day to when we have to think of the victims. We have to think of the people that died on that day and how horrific it must have been, especially for those people in the World Trade Center. The images of hundreds of people jumping to their deaths. It was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen in my life, and I'm not going to show that here because we've all seen this stuff enough times. But they sure did know how to corral us all into their mind fuck, corral us all into believing that there was some horrible terrorist force out there to get us, and that all these things must be done. Invasion of the Middle East, take over the oil production, all the security changes within the United States, the police state that they ushered in. So many things happened in the aftermath of 9/11. Sometimes I find it comical when people talk about how the Boston bombing or Sandy Hook is bigger than 9/11. You got to be shitting yourself, right? 9/11 is the granddaddy of false flag events. There's nothing that comes close to it. And for those of us who lived through it and have, since been awakened by the lie, the immense lie that it is, we understand the gravity of that day and how much it has been used to completely dismantle our rights. And that's here as much as it is in Great Britain. Of course, 7/7 there. We had our, false false flags here as well. And the beat goes on. It is up to us, is it incumbent upon us who are awakened to awaken as many other people as possible. You might lose friends as a result. You might even lose family. God knows it's happened to me. People will label you a conspiracy theorist, but think of it. If we do win down the road, I mean, if this is exposed, if enough high-ranking people come out, if somebody who was involved in the plot comes out, spills the beans, and it goes viral, imagine how good you're going to feel about all the times you've tried to convince people to look into 9/11 and to look at things like Building 7 and all that. The truth is on our side, and as long as we have the truth on our side, then we cannot really lose. The only way we're going to lose is if they are able to do another false flag and have the similar type of effect that 9/11 had. I said, was it last week or a few days ago when I put up the Alex Jones fear thing there regarding the possibility of nuclear weapons going unsigned to a different location and the potential of a false flag. Of course, Lindsey Graham coming out saying Charleston Harbor. If something like that were to happen, if another false flag were to happen, then we have to hope that enough people have awoken at this point. And perhaps it has. I mean, I think the numbers coming in on 9/11, I think it's almost 50% of people now don't trust the official story. If we can push that even further, using the anniversary now to get more information out, to have more people talking about it, then perhaps we can put enough, or we can plant enough seeds of doubt amongst the people who are becoming increasingly, day by day, distrustful of the mainstream media, distrustful of the politicians, and starting to waken up to the fact that there are higher powers that are pulling the strings behind our puppet leaders. Then maybe they can't get away with it next time. And that is the goal, I think, of most of us. It certainly is my goal. If we can wake up enough people, then the next time they try to pull one of these things, especially now with the internet, perhaps we can blow it open before they can use it to usher in, the New World Order as they see it. Anyways, it's a sad day to remember, and I'd like to hear your stories about 9/11. If you have a good story, please put it down below. Leave your comments, thumbs up the video, and subscribe if you haven't already. And keep up the good fight. All the best to you.